share with you some upcoming things we also have going on. But I wanted to take a minute and introduce Lindsay, who is our Director of Prevention Initiatives, and she will be taking us through this class. So enjoy. And Lindsay, it's all yours.
Thanks, Christy. Hi, everybody. I hope everyone can see my screen and you can hear me. As Christy said, my name is Lindsay Burkhardt, and I serve as the Director of Prevention Initiatives here at Families Flourish ND. The last I looked today, as I was getting ready to start our session, I saw that we had 232 people sign up for today's session. And I just think that is absolutely amazing. It shows the desire to learn more, especially about such a vital topic like healthy sexual development in children. It's just truly amazing. I'm honored to share the next hour with you. I know as someone who works in this field and is a professional in this world that there is a plethora of professional development and training opportunities. And I'm just so grateful that you decided to choose this one and be here with me. I know as I was looking through registration, I saw so many familiar faces and familiar names. So again, just thank you. And if you're new here, I'll take a minute to introduce myself in a second. So, one thing that if you've heard me before, you know this, I am super intentional with my PowerPoint designs. Sometimes they're bright and colorful, but today I decided to go with flowers. Very intentional. Flowers to me and to many symbolize growth, right? They symbolize resilience. And also, I think that they symbolize beauty that can emerge when we nurture and protect what matters most. And for us today, that is our children. Just like a garden, children thrive, right? When they're supported, when they're cared for, nurtured, given space to grow in healthy environments. So I know sometimes I get a little silly with my design choice, but there's always intention and reasoning behind it. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that can feel challenging, but it's incredibly important. It's sexual development in children. I always am very intentional about what I share, what I look for resources and research in this area. And everything I'll be sharing with you today is grounded in research. So, if I cover anything or you want more information, you have questions about specific data, please don't ever hesitate to reach out, email me. You'll get my contact information at the end. I'm always happy to share more. But without any further ado, let's talk about our session objectives for today. We have 3 objectives, as you'll see on screen. And as we go through our session, when we cover one of these specific objectives, you're going to know because you're going to see it at the bottom of the slide. So it's also for me as a presenter to make sure that, yep, Lindsay, you're covering everything you said you were going to do, and for you just to know that I'm doing what I said I would. Throughout our session, I just want to let you know that I'm going to be using the term your child, our children. This could mean your own biological child. It could be a grandchild, a child you care about. Maybe it's a foster child, a child that you work with. So when I say our children, your child, just think about the children in your life that you care for. And that's who I'm talking about. So my name is Lindsay, as I mentioned right when we got started. I'm from the very southeastern corner of North Dakota. Some of you may have heard of the little town I grew up by. It's called Great Bend. Based on census data, you maybe haven't heard of it because the current population is about 52 people. So it is the definition of a small town, and I love it. My background is in early childhood education. I've always wanted, growing up, to be a teacher. I love working with children, but my professional path switched gears somewhere along the way. And now I am currently the Director of Prevention Initiatives here at Families Flourish ND. And what that means is I work in child abuse prevention, and I do a lot of different things, but I really like to focus my time on child sexual abuse prevention. I was the former director of the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force for several years up until it dissolved. So that drives a lot of the work I continue to do. I am the best hat, I guess you could say, that I wear is I'm a mom to 4 girls. I'm an active volunteer in my community through programs like Bio Girls and the Humane Society of the Lakes. My daughter and I go every couple of weeks to PetSmart, and we work with the kitties that are in need of homes. And it's funny, but it's actually not funny because she loves animals, she loves cats, she loves doing this work, but um, she gets to play with them, socialize with them, give them treats, and I get to scoop the cat boxes and clean their little houses. So I'm like, maybe we need to switch roles here a little bit because this doesn't necessarily feel fair all the time. But um, a couple of things on screen. I do a lot of this work. I train. I have the ability, the privilege, the honor of being asked to train all across North Dakota. On screen, you'll find one of my sessions I did with the Head Start program. Love, love, love Head Start. Spent a lot of my time working in that field as well. I'm an ordained minister. That's my sister getting married there at the bottom left. And if you see me, you usually will see me with some type of coffee cup because I love coffee. So that's a little bit more about me and who I am. I do this work to create a better tomorrow for the children across North Dakota, for my girls, but I'm also really motivated to do this work for the survivors in my life who I love. And not only those special survivors that I get to have this close relationship with and that I love so much, but survivors everywhere, because there are an estimated 42 million adult survivors across the United States today of child sexual abuse. Before we begin, I want to offer just a gentle warning, content warning. We'll be discussing aspects of sexual development. And additionally, we're going to dive into things like concerning sexual behaviors. And while I think this session is educational and it's presented in a non graphic way, I think it's pretty easy to listen to, full of information. But I also know that it can bring up strong emotions, even memories for some people. So feel free at any time to turn off your camera if you need to, step away and just take care of yourself and take whatever you need. So before we really dive into our content, um, I want to talk about why this matters. Especially, I want to ground us in prevention. So what I know and what I've learned over the last several years is that one of the strongest protective factors against child sexual abuse is adults who understand what's healthy, expected, healthy sexual development at these different developmental stages. Because the thing is that when we don't, let's start there, when we don't have that clarity, we might overreact to something we see, or we could underreact, right? It's not that serious. But both of those reactions really miss opportunities to keep children safe. Overreacting can create shame. And we're going to talk about shame today and why we really need to take a different path when we're talking to children, especially about their bodies and sexuality as they grow. But then underreacting can overlook risk. When we understand sexual development, the thing is that we can respond calmly, we can respond early, and we can respond appropriately. And that's what prevention looks like. Today is really about building a shared foundation so that we can support healthy development. We can recognize when something needs extra support or extra attention. We're going to know how to respond when we see something. And we're going to also be able then to create safer environments for our children, which is what we really want. Sexuality is a normal part of life, even babies and young children. Like other aspects of development, sexual development typically follows a pretty typical trajectory, and that's shaped by a child's age, curiosity, the environment around them. Sexual development includes not only the physical changes that occur as our children grow, but it's also like the sexual knowledge and beliefs that they come to learn as they grow, even the behaviors that they show. And at any given age, a child's sexual knowledge and behavior is strongly influenced by number one, how old that child is, also what that child observes, right? What's around them. That could be even sexual behaviors of their family or friends, or how relationships look in their family. And then the third one is what the child is taught. And that could be anything from cultural beliefs to religious beliefs concerning sexuality, physical boundaries, relationships. And so, one thing that I want to do here is just take a moment and think about whether you're a parent and you're here today as a caregiver, you're here today in your professional role. I just want you to think about, have you ever witnessed a child's behavior and wondered, is this normal? Is this okay? Right? And you can even put it in the chat box too. Have you ever witnessed something and been like, ooh, I don't know what to do? I know for me that has happened more than once. I told you I have 4 daughters, but before I had those little girls, I was a classroom teacher in Head Start. And there was more than one time when I was like, oh gosh, what do I do? The thing is that many adults are not ever taught what to expect as children develop sexually, making it really tricky for us to distinguish between healthy, normal, typical behaviors. I'm kind of moving away from that into those concerning potentially abusive behaviors, right? We don't really know how to distinguish between those. We're not taught about that. And let me further that a little bit too, because if you remember in my introduction, I shared with you that I went to school for early childhood education and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about children's cognitive development. I learned about their social emotional development, their gross motor development. I learned a lot of really important things, but I don't recall time spent learning on children's sexual development. And I went to school to work with young children. So I think that really stands out to me, right? We don't get a lot of education in this area. And then again, making it really hard for us to learn what's healthy and what's not. So just taking a moment to thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this really important topic. So we're going to talk about what behaviors are considered healthy. So in general, children who are involved in healthy sexual exploration, these interactions are typically consensual and they're voluntary. The thing is that they typically happen between children who play together often. These children are of similar age and size. This exploration is driven more out of curiosity than overtly sexual in nature. These are not aggressive, they're not forceful or hurtful interactions. And the other thing is that they're easy to redirect. Okay, now it's time for us to go play on the slides. Just really easy to redirect the child. It's not hard to get them to divert their attention to something else. These are not frequently happening. They're unplanned, spontaneous interactions. So we're going to take a second to dig deeper into these healthy stages, these healthy developmental stages that children go through. And while we maybe do feel confident in our knowledge of child development, especially if you're here today and you work with children, maybe you work in a childcare and you're like, yep, I know how children develop. The thing is that there's often gaps in our knowledge of children's sexual development, right? I just talked about this and just my lack of training and education in this area when I was coming into this field. And then as a result, we may not be aware that children display sexual behaviors as part of their healthy, typical, normal development. And so what that looks like is going to be on screen. So I also think it's important to point out that 3 of my 4 children fall within these ages. So these feel so familiar to me. And then again, working in Head Start, which was birth to 5, I feel like this is pretty familiar. These are things that I was seeing. So in general, a young child's behaviors that are easy to redirect, they're not causing harm or distress. They're not a cause for concern. They're considered normal sexual development. So we're going to talk through, I'm not going to go through every single bullet and talk through these in great depth, but I do want to talk about some of them. So let's start with that birth to 2. Be curious about their bodies, right? If you're changing their diaper, their hands may wander. Be curious about their genitals. be able to point to their named body parts as they grow, show affection towards caregivers. Infants experience close emotional attachments to their parents and those primary caregivers. This is such an important first experience of relationships and not just physical closeness and intimacy. If you have a kiddo this age or you work with kiddos this age, you know that they have no inhibitions about being naked. They'll run through the whole house or hallway completely naked, not a care in the world, right? So as our little ones grow, we have our 3 to 4 year olds become aware of and curious about their body differences. They self-soothe. They might touch and explore their genitals. This is something we need to talk a little bit more about. So this is something that I learned a lot about from Prevent Child Abuse Vermont. This idea that it's self-soothing, it's not that children are masturbating when they're touching their genitals. What we know about young children is that they do a lot of things to self-soothe, right? You may know a kiddo that twirls their hair, maybe they suck their thumbs, they hold a silky blanket, or they like to have it by their face. And some children touch their genitals to self-soothe. Doing this is sensory learning, it's self-soothing, it's body awareness. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into this shortly. But just because the behavior is on screen right now, we consider it healthy, a healthy part of development. It does not mean that we shouldn't intervene or that we shouldn't redirect them in these moments. And we're going to talk about how to respond to these situations soon in a way that's appropriate. The other one here that, I mean, again, if you've worked with young children, you have young children, they talk about bodily functions, they ask questions, they think it's hilarious sometimes. I think just the other day I heard, Mommy, sometimes when I pee, I toot. Very normal to recognize the different functions of their bodies and talk about them. So our 5 to 8 year olds, they're getting a little bit. One thing before we jump on in, I don't know if any of you were kind of caught up on this one. Engage in mild sex play. Let's talk a little bit deeper about that one too. What that looks like is children imitating what they see, maybe within their home. We know it's normal for children that if they maybe witness their mom kiss their dad goodbye in the morning, maybe they'll try to kiss a classmate on the playground if they're playing house. Children imitate what's normal and a part of their family history, what they're seeing and witnessing. An example of this, and I am someone who, if you've heard me talk before, I love examples. I think it's just such a great way to solidify learning. I learn best when I hear examples, so I share a lot. One of the things that I had heard from a center is that they had to take the rug out of their house center because children in their classroom would take off their clothes and get under the rug for bedtime. And what they ended up saying is that they had further learned that one of the children's mom loved soap operas. And so the child had some exposure, had seen this is what they're doing on TV. And so it was just mimicking what they had seen. But what we would consider, and what that daycare did, that childcare did, is they removed the rug and they redirected the children and they didn't see the behavior again. But more unexpected would be if you witnessed that and then a child was acting out like adult type sexual acts, maybe laying on another child, grinding their genitals on them. This would be more of an indicator of exposure, which we're going to be talking about shortly here. Especially in this stage, we're going to have more questions. And sometimes we're like, I don't know how to answer this. Like, where do babies come from? Why do boys stand up when they're in the bathroom? How does the baby get out of their mom? I can speak a lot about those questions because I feel like I get them a lot, especially at bedtime when we're trying to go to sleep. And I have some really great resources to help you answer those questions. And we're going to talk about those towards the end of our session together today. So our kids are getting older, right? They're starting school, 5 to 8 years old. So what is that, kindergarten through about second grade? Begin to know about sexual intercourse, 6 to 9 years old. That means how to make a baby. This was always really hard for me to hear. Let me just preface this with that. When I started this work, I was like, what do you mean my 5 to 8 year old is going to begin learning about this? But I have taken countless trainings and learned a lot in this field. And over the last several years, I've heard more and more that if you don't talk to your children by the time they're in about third grade, they're going to have heard about it on the playground from their friends or heard about it from someone else. As they continue to grow, you're going to see that increased desire for privacy. They might start to compare their body parts to their peers. One thing I want to emphasize before we go on and we start talking about those 9-year-olds and up is that these ages, I think, are so foundational for us to start talking about body safety. I'm talking body safety rules, consent, boundaries, respecting self and others. I love talking about child sexual abuse prevention strategies. And not only just for that, but also just healthy relationships as they grow. In early April, we will be doing a session that will really dig in deep to how can we teach consent, how can we talk about healthy boundaries, how do we foster those within children. So if that's something of interest to you that you want to learn more about, just stay tuned and I'll share more information with you. But these are such important ages to start having these conversations with our children about. All right, they're getting older, right? 9 to 12 years old. Begin puberty. What do you mean? Oh, I have a 10-year-old. And what we know is that globally, physicians now typically consider puberty onset between the ages of 8 and 13 in girls as a part of a normal range. Young people are experiencing puberty earlier than ever before. One thing I found really interesting when I was looking into this more was that in the 1840s, I know what, a while ago, the average age of like the time a girl would get her period, first menstruation, was about 16 or 17 years old. And today it's around 12 years old. For boys, puberty begins around 11 on average, although it can start as early as 9, sometimes maybe as late as 14. That's all considered normal. Um, Become more modest. They're going to keep wanting that privacy when they're changing or going to the bathroom. Be curious about their changing bodies. They're going to develop crushes on friends, teens, or celebrities. Anyone else remember their first crush? Right. I was like 4, and I remember my first crush was Patrick Swayze. I don't know why my parents were letting me watch Dirty Dancing, but first crush, Patrick Swayze. I know that if you might remember yours as well. Um, and then as our kiddos are growing, 13 to 18, when I think about this stage in particular, my children aren't at this stage. I can reflect on my own development at this time, and I do recall many of these feelings. There's more risk taking, experimenting, looking for different ways to express ourselves. Really, those strong bonds with our friends, peer pressure, making big decisions. The one thing that in this field and having done this work, the more that I learned about these stages of healthy development, what's normal, the more curious, the more drawn I became to learning about what's considered concerning or problematic. And the more I learned about that, I then wanted to say, well, why? Why are we seeing these behaviors, or why do children display these concerning behaviors? So we're going to go there next. I've had the great honor of learning from, I would say, 2 really exceptional professionals who work with children exhibiting concerning sexual behaviors at a national level. And based on both of their experience, their research, professional consensus that there are 4 factors that may contribute to a child engaging in concerning sexual behaviors. And we're going to talk about examples of what that looks like in about 2 slides here. But first, let's talk about why, or what may drive children. And you'll see those on screen. So exposure to sexuality, family adversity, individual child characteristics, exposure to aggression or coercive control. If it's okay with you, I just want to take a minute to talk through what that can look like. So the first one, let's talk about exposure to sexuality. This could be that a child has been sexually abused. It could be that this child has witnessed others engage in sexual behavior. And that could be around their home, what their caregivers are doing. It could be exposure to sexualized media, such as pornography, which it's not a session for me if we don't talk about pornography. So we're going to dig into that in a second here. It could be that they just live in a home where there's increased family sexuality, so a lack of privacy norms, nudity without explanation or consent. Could also be that they're witnessing more over sexualized behavior by caregivers, really blurring the boundaries. The next one is individual child characteristics. So, children with sexual behavior challenges often exhibit other challenging behaviors and social difficulties. And that could be like a lack of impulse control, difficulty following the rules, difficulty making friends or initiating play with others. Also, it could be a limited set of self regulation skills. The third one on the bottom left, family adversity. So these are factors that adversely impact a caregiver's ability to provide safety, supervision, guidance, behavior management. And this could be for a lot of reasons. It could be because the family has minimal support. It could be because they've just had limited educational opportunities. It could be that the family has experienced trauma, the caregivers have experienced trauma. It could also be due to poverty. And again, that list is not all inclusive, right? Adversity can mean a lot of things. And then lastly, on the bottom right, exposure to aggression or coercive behavior or coercive control is what I often say. This could be a child that's living in a home where there's harsh physical discipline. It could be that they are witnessing or experiencing interpersonal violence, witnessing domestic violence. It could also be witnessing community violence. Maybe they live in a part of town where the neighborhood has more violence. And it's important to note that the driving factors could be from any one or mix of these categories. And before we move on, I want to emphasize that these factors on screen do not mean that a child is destined to harm others. They simply represent areas that may increase the risk of displaying more of these concerning sexual behaviors. The more that we take a minute to learn about and recognize these risks, it really is going to allow us to step back, take a breath, allow us to respond with guidance, support, prevention. And those are the things that we're going to be talking about soon. One thing that, again, like I just said, if you're in a session with me and we even breeze over pornography, like I cannot help myself, I want to talk more about this. And as we talked about exposure to sexuality, we talked about maybe that exposure to sexualized media. So let's take a minute to talk about pornography because it's impacting our children. I've taken a lot of classes over the years specific to pornography and learning about the impacts that it's having on our children. And this topic deserves our time, it deserves our attention and our concern. Research varies by study, but many kids have, by the time they're 12, have had exposure to pornography. In some studies, again, it just depends on the research, but they say that exposure happens as young as 7 years old. What we know about pornography is that this exposure is that it's shaping our children's sexual template. And do you think they're oftentimes seen loving, caring relationships? Not usually. It's violent, degrading content, and it promotes really unhealthy ideas about what sex is, what relationships look like, and even gender roles. Porn can lead to addictive patterns, right? It triggers that dopamine surge when people are watching it, and that can lead to more compulsive use. And the reason I take time to talk about this is because like we know that our children are having this exposure. We can't really ignore it and turn our backs to it. We also then need to acknowledge that if they're having this exposure, that it's impacting them. It's impacting their development. The things I'm going to talk about as far as impacts are more related to, they're not related to like, okay, one time on the school bus, I accidentally saw this. What I'm going to share with you is linked to repeated or heavy exposure to pornography, especially when it starts at a young age and it continues over time. So, with that exposure, we know that with boys, there's an increased risk of anxiety, depression. They have greater vulnerability to abuse, higher likelihood of risky sexual behaviors. This one scares me. There's a lower capacity for empathy, We know that erectile dysfunction is linked to heavy exposure as well, and then sexualizing younger girls at an increasing rate as well. What research also tells us is then there's impacts on our girls who have that longer exposure at younger ages, and that's an increase in self-hatred, body dissatisfaction, higher rates of depression and anxiety, greater risk of self-harm. With that, I think it's really easy for us to assume, like, well, my children aren't going to see that. You know, I'm with them. I'm with them when they're on a device. I know that they're not going to have this exposure. Well, I feel that way too, for the most part, but my children also ride a school bus. And I know that they've seen videos that I wouldn't approve of, like music videos. My one daughter is also in sports. And I know that, you know, they have time between games or, and some of her friends have devices. So, or they go to a friend's house. So I think the thing is that although we don't think it'll happen on our watch or on our time, it doesn't mean that that exposure is not going to happen. The thing I want to say about this is having this conversation can be awkward. You bet. I'll be the first to say it. I was not prepared to talk to my daughter about pornography, but knowing that young age where that first exposure happens, I was like, okay, I got to talk to her about this. I didn't have a plan. I forged forward and it did not go well. Within about 45 seconds, she was like head in her arm down, not looking at me. I struggled to find the words. I had no idea what I was doing. It was a flop. Um, but since then, you know, I've thought more about how I want to talk to her about this. The thing is, though, is that I think about that first experience and how awkward that was. Oh, you know, if you see this, they might be naked doing things that you don't understand. Like it was awkward and it was not great. But I find comfort in knowing that number one, that conversation got easier from that starting point. But number two, if that exposure would have happened or if it had happened, she's going to say, oh, this is what my mom was talking to me about. Yeah, this is what my mom told me about. I know what this is. And she'll know she can talk to me. And I know that it's hard to even think about, like, okay, well, how am I going to do this? But it can be really simple. It can start off with sometimes there's pictures or videos of people showing their private parts doing private things. These are not for kids. They can be scary, confusing, uncomfortable. And if you ever see something like that, I just want you to know it's not your fault. You're not in trouble and you can talk to me about it. I can help. You know, it can start small and it can become a conversation that is built into more regular life and conversations that we have. But I say this because it's important that we have the conversation and we start somewhere. Thank you for going down that route with me. I wish I could avoid it, but I feel the need to talk about it every time. So now let's talk about some of those concerning sexual behaviors. Between 35% and 71% of child sexual abuse is committed by other children. I just want you to take a second with that. When I first started in this role, we would say about 40% of children were sexually abused by their children. More recent research shows about 70% of children are abused by their children. I want us to understand that understanding and addressing harmful, concerning sexual behaviors when they arise is vital to preventing sexual abuse. The items on screen are considered concerning sexual behaviors. Right? There's a clear indication of a problem. The behaviors are aggressive, intrusive, coercive. These behaviors signal the need to provide immediate protection, not only for that child, but for other children as well. And we're going to talk again. This is not talking about how we respond when we see these. We're going to get to that. But just look through some of the examples on screen involving sexual play with animals, when there's force to engage others in sexual play. Maybe it's a knowledge of sex well beyond their age, which is like more adult type sexual activities, sexual play with a bigger age gap with much younger or older children. The other thing here is that there's a preoccupation with sexual play at the exclusion of other forms of play. So this could be if you're a classroom teacher where you have a child who has this obsession with this type of play, it's really hard to redirect them. You're not able to get them to go play with the manipulatives or to go play on the swings. Again, that preoccupation with sexual play, hard to redirect. When thinking about sexual behaviors in children, it can be helpful to use like a stoplight to talk through the different behaviors. We have the three categories that you'll see on our stoplights. Those healthy and normal behaviors are green, right? Normal things. We talked about healthy development. The yellow are more of those cautionary behaviors. We haven't talked about those yet, but we're going to talk about them. And we're going to talk about how to respond when we see children that are displaying behaviors that are a bit further away from the norm. And then we have those behaviors that are considered concerning, the behaviors that we just talked about on the screen previously. And this is where I hope that you'll gather so much information about ways to respond in ways that are helpful and appropriate when we see these behaviors. So let's start with those healthy, more common behaviors. So as we talked about, these are the normal, the age appropriate, spontaneous, they're lighthearted, mutual, typically happening between children of similar age. These are interactions that are easy to redirect. We've talked all about these behaviors today. When we see a child displaying this behavior, the tone is guidance. We're not shaming them, we're not punishing them, we're not being punitive. And I'm going to talk a little more in depth about shame on the next slide because I think it's something, again, that we need to really think about when we're working with children. The thing is that just because the behavior is normal, because it's common, we've talked about it today, it doesn't mean that we should ignore it. Often, when we see children who are engaged in sexual behaviors, it indicates that they need to learn something. And in those moments, we would teach them what they need to know given that situation. So again, remember, I like examples. So as I looked at the sign up sheet, I saw that we had some like childcare providers on. So let's talk about it through that lens. So let's pretend you are a classroom teacher and you have preschoolers, those 3 to 5 year olds, and you notice that there's some giggling and like a toy structure. Okay. You hear this giggling, you hear this squealing. Well, you peek in and you find them sitting on the ground with their underwear off, pointing at and touching each other's genitals. In this case, if you remember, it's very normal at this age to be really curious about other people's body parts. But in this case, they need to learn something, right? We would teach the children that it's okay to be curious about other people's bodies, but private parts should be kept private, even with our friends. Non-shaming tone, providing them with information, and then what are we doing? Let's go play on the swings, or let's go play with whatever on the playground, the slide. And then you redirect to a new activity. You can see some other ways to respond on screen. So it could be in our house, privacy is a really big deal, right? I have 4 girls. They all want the bathroom and they all want privacy, which is great. Makes it tricky when you're trying to juggle that many girls in one bathroom for them. But, you might say, your sister needs privacy when she's going to the bathroom or when she's changing her clothes. You can wait outside her or outside the bathroom door until she's finished. And even just opening the door, like if you have questions about your body, you can ask me. That's a private behavior. This is not a private place. For example, if a child is self-soothing in a place that is more common of the home, like the living room. Research shows that when us as adults communicate with children in open, non-judgmental, supportive ways, it really strengthens trust with our children. It helps with that emotional regulation and help seeking, right? They're going to know that they can come talk to you. They're going to know that they can ask questions. And we know that those are all really protective for healthy development. So this is where I wanted to talk about shame a little bit. We have 107 people on the call right now. I don't doubt that someone in this room was shamed as a child. And what we know about shame, I've been shamed as a child, is that it follows you your entire life. It really does. You can remember how you feel in that moment. We know that shame is a deeply distressing emotion, that it can harm self-worth and well-being. And again, it can follow you your whole life. The thing about shame is that it's not inherent. It's learned, right? Research shows that children's body shame is heavily shaped by adult reactions. Children's body shame is heavily shaped by adult reactions, parental attention, cultural messages. Shaming a child for displaying sexual behaviors can have serious consequences. They're more likely to develop harmful attitudes toward their own bodies. It can lead to children hiding behaviors, emotions, reducing communication, not coming to you when they have questions. And when we react with discomfort, they might think that their bodies are bad or dirty or questions are bad. They're not going to ask those. So I think the reason I add this in is because not only have I been a child who's been shamed, um, but just knowing that in those moments, like when we see something like a child touching their body, instead of being like, "Oh, knock it off. That's gross. Don't do that. Why are you doing that?" Just think about the impact of shame. And that's why learning about different ways to respond in these different situations is so important. And keep in mind, as we continue to move through responding to children's behaviors, we never talk about shame or punishing or being punitive with them. And it seems really obvious, right, that we wouldn't shame about this or shame with this. But I mean, I'm not gonna just pretend like I'm this perfect mom and I've always done this right, because I haven't, and I still mess up. And there are times when I'll like be like, "Oh, don't do that," or I'll say something that I'm like, "Gosh, Lindsay, you sure could have handled that a little bit better." And I'll own that as a mom. I've done that before, but I think how we look forward is really important, especially when it comes to these types of behaviors, and think about how we're responding. So as I noted, we have yellow behaviors. We have something that's a little less common. Maybe it's less frequent. It's potentially concerning, just really depending on context, frequency, coercion. These types of behaviors we need to monitor. We need to provide extra support. So these behaviors, they could be examples are helpful, right? So it could be persistent questions about sexuality despite you having answered it 100 times, like they keep asking. It could be a child who's using some force, so like maybe pulling down a child's pants or pulling up a skirt. It could be also following others into private spaces like the bathrooms, especially after we've said, "Okay, I'm concerned because I've asked you to stop doing that and give your friend privacy. You need to stop doing that." It could also be repeated jokes that are sexual in nature, or references that are above or beyond age norms. So these are more borderline, cautionary, require our monitoring. The thing about yellow behaviors is that they can either diminish or they can escalate. In these situations, when you see these behaviors that you're like, "Oh, this isn't quite concerning, but it seems a little bit further away from being normal," we need to confront and prohibit the behaviors. And that's where we use some of the language on screen. "I'm concerned because I see you doing this. After we discussed it, you need to stop doing that." Non-shaming tone, communicating in that direct language, providing monitoring of this child. And then how do we respond when we see those concerning behaviors? Well, first I want to say the three bullets really outline what we need to do. But first of all, we need to be really vigilant in monitoring the child with these behaviors, especially when they're around other children. Regardless of the motivation, we must recognize the risk of possible harm to others. These situations, they really require a coordinated intervention and response. So, what we know is that children who engage in concerning sexual behaviors need specialized help. I know it's beyond my scope of background or expertise to provide this type of a response to a child or the support to a child. These children need specialized help. Counseling for the caregivers and families of the child is also typically a pretty important component to successfully stop the behavior. Um, we need to monitor these children. I know I said that, but I say it again because I've had the opportunity and the privilege to work with a lot of childcare centers. And I know that there are times when we see some of these concerning behaviors, we let that child, we're not, super strict on monitoring, or we take our eyes off them, and then something worse happens. And I have seen that happen more than one time. The other thing is that we do need to be prepared to make a report. And I know for some people that can feel really unsettling. But anytime you have a concern about a child's sexual behavior, it falls under those concerning behaviors that we've covered about today. You file a report, and intake will screen from there. We also need to understand that sometimes is the first step in getting that child those services that they need. And as we wrap up this little section and we start to think about how we can talk to our kids moving forward. I like to share some research based facts as we wrap this up. So, what we know is that many children demonstrate sexual behaviors in peer settings. So, especially if you're here today, you work in a childcare, or you have a daycare, or you just have a bunch of kids like me, children, it's pretty normal that we're going to see sexual behavior, especially in those peer settings. Children with those cautionaries, more those yellow or red behaviors, have not always been abused. Children with sexual behavior problems are not younger versions of adult sex offenders. And lastly, the really, really good news is that most children who receive treatment for sexual behaviors do not continue that behavior into adolescence and into adulthood. Recidivism rates are really low. That's good news. So this gets to be like my favorite part of the session anytime that we're talking about what can we be doing, how can we be talking to our kids. So thank you for hanging tight with me. We're getting closer to the end of our session today. This part of these last couple slides really will highlight tools, strategies that you may find helpful. Whatever your role is, whether you're here today as a mama, or you're here as an uncle, or you're here as someone who works with children, we're going to talk about ways to talk with kids, how we can use teachable moments, and how we can answer questions with confidence and care. And the thing, I know I've said this before, especially when we were talking about pornography, is that these conversations aren't always easy. They don't always feel natural, but they're incredibly important. And I guess I would just think about like myself growing up. I don't remember my parents talking to me about anything. I don't remember talking about my period. I don't remember talking about sex. I don't remember talking about relationships. I don't remember these conversations happening. For me as a child growing up, I don't know about you, and how these conversations were happening, if they were happening as you were growing. But these conversations are so incredibly important, and I want you to know that you're not alone in navigating them. I did actually add in a bunch of different resources that you can look at, and if you want to print them out or go on Amazon and get them, you sure can. So let's talk about the first thing is just talking to children about this stuff. Well, we need to start early if we can. And if you haven't started early, that's okay. We're going to talk about that too. But we need to start early, use everyday events. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth on the next slide about how we can use teachable moments with children. These are everyday, ongoing, built into normal life conversations. One of the big ones is using anatomically correct terms for all body parts. If you're not doing this yet, please, it's time to start. You know, words like penis, vulva, vagina, testicles, anus are often treated as taboo. For generations, adults have avoided these anatomical terms, and we often will replace them with things like wee wee, cookie, flower, pee pee. While these words are more comfortable for us, they can create real problems for our children. There was one study where researchers interviewed 91 convicted sex offenders, and many of them reported that they're less likely to target children who know correct anatomical terms because it may increase their risk of getting caught. And if a disclosure happens, having the correct terms is really important. Teaching anatomical language doesn't have to be awkward or uncomfortable. It can just be as simple as naming other parts of the body. And do you see that research on the side of the slide there? 89% of children know the names of their non-genital body parts, and only 10% know the correct names. This is something we can start today with children. If you work in a childcare and you're like, okay, well, how am I gonna start saying this when I'm helping them diaper? How can I start using these words? Well, I have a policy that you can put into your manual, that your parent handbook that really outlines that this is a part of just our policy that we use these words. So if you would like a copy of that, please reach out to me afterwards. Continuing on, talk about biology and attitudes more than just sex. Talk with children about healthy relationships, feelings, peer pressure, body image, responsibility in relationships and friendships. This will help your child to identify the normal aspects or the emotional aspects of sexuality and relationships. And I want to emphasize here, children learn about relationships, emotions, boundaries, body respect first and most consistently through what adults do, not what they say. Think about what we're modeling. Acknowledge or understand that sexual response, even in young children, is a reflexive response. This means that a sexual response is involuntary and or it's unconscious, like breathing, and that arousal occurs in response to touch, regardless of how the child felt emotionally about the touch. Be sure to give positive messages about their bodies, those physical responses, not shaming. We talked about why that's important. Our response matters. If we aren't talking to our kids, remember they're talking to their friends on the playground. They might be going online to learn more. And we know that while the internet can be a good source of information, we want them to hear it from us. We want them to learn from us as much as possible. So make sure that you're letting your child know that they can come to you with anything. They can ask questions. They're not going to get in trouble. We just want them to get the right information. And again, before we go to the next slide and talk about teachable moments, I want you to know, don't worry if you have kids in middle school or high school and you haven't talked about this stuff. It's not too late. There are lots of ways to just get the conversation started, get the conversation going. Just don't try to catch up all at once. That would be overwhelming for everybody. Little talks over time. Just start there. And again, I know I said this, but just make it really clear to your child that they can ask you questions. Um, there's no shame, there's no judgment. And we're here to be that information source for them. I love teachable moments. So again, my background is as being a teacher. You use teachable moments all the time with your kids. This is something you can do in everyday life. So one of the things that you could, let's pretend another example. So you're all clothes shopping with your child. You see a group of high school students joking around. A couple of the girls run up behind one of the boys and they pretend to pull down his pants. Okay, this is a real thing that could happen. You're just at the store with your kiddo. The boy looks shocked and he looks embarrassed. And then the girls start to tease him and say, "Oh, why are you upset? All boys want pretty girls to pull down their pants." So that could be a situation that you see or you witness, and at that moment, you can use it as a teachable moment if you want to. So consider whether the topic is one that you want to discuss. Does it touch on your values? Is it important to your family? Is it a safety issue? You can open the conversation, use a simple statement about what you just witnessed. Try to avoid judgment when you say this. Like, what do you think about what just happened? Listen to what the child has to say, tune into what they're thinking and feeling. And then at that point, you get to share your perspective, limiting it to those key points that feel vital and essential to you. Talking with children about sexuality is something that becomes easier with practice. Be gentle with yourself because you're probably going to mess up like I did, and it might happen more than once, and that's okay. It's just a part of these conversations, I think. So the more tools we have, the better, right? The better equipped we are going to be to support children. Anyone on this call ever been asked a question by your kiddo and you're like, "Ooh, I don't know what to say." I'll never forget when I was pregnant with our fourth daughter, and my one daughter was like, "Oh, how'd the baby get there?" Again, right at bedtime when it's like, "Okay, come on, we gotta go to sleep." And having those answers and knowing how to respond can feel really overwhelming. But there are a lot of resources that can help us navigate those conversations. But remember, before you answer questions, it's always important to be honest, right? We're not going to give them inaccurate information. The stork does not bring the babies. Being developmentally appropriate, think about how old they are, where they're at developmentally as a way, as a guide as you're responding. Books can really be helpful with this. And I just want to say it's okay to not have the answers, to not know what to say. That's where I turn to books all the time. So this framework on screen came from Vermont. It's called the LAST method, and it helps to provide just an easy way for us to think about when we're answering questions about sexuality. I know for myself, when I get asked some questions, I'm like, "Oh gosh, it causes anxiety or embarrassment." And in those moments, I'm probably not going to answer the question how I really want to or the best way. So this method is a way to carve out some time, really get a better sense of what the child's asking, and then help us answer. So the child asks you a question, you listen deeply, and instead of assuming that you already know what they're going to say, just listening to the question, ask the child what they think first. What do you think? And that gives you a lot more information sometimes. It could be the child asking you, "Well, how's the baby going to get out?" "Okay, what do you think?" And they might come back and say, "Well, I think the baby's going to get out at the hospital." right? And then we start to understand that the child's question was less about the birth process and more about where the baby's going to be born. That helps a lot, right? The S is sorting out your emotions, really thinking about like, am I the best person to be answering this question? I know if you are a teacher on this call, you're like, oh boy, that's not my question, right? So you can tell the child that, you maybe aren't the best person, but that would be a good question for their mom. And if they want you to help them ask, you can. And then talk with respect at the child's level, at their developmental level. Keep answers short, simple, and accurate. You're not alone. You don't have to have all the answers for all of this. So here are some resources that I really enjoy. This one up here, It's Not the Stork. That's a really good book. Actually, I really, really like it, especially when I was pregnant with my last daughter, because a lot of questions were coming up. I just found that when I was asking my girls to get stuff ready to donate to Savers, that they donated this book. So I'm gonna have to buy it again. I was like, come on. Oh, dang it. Maybe they don't like it as much as I do, but I think it's a great book. Here are some books for you. The Parent's Guide to Talking About Sex, Sex Positive Talks. And I'm just sharing resources. I'm not saying that these are what you should use. The Boys Body Book, the Girls Body Book. My daughter has this one, the Girls Body Book and Celebrate Your Body. Sometimes it's just where I read a chapter, I have her read a chapter, and then I give her post-it notes. Do you have any questions? Is there anything you want to talk more with mom about? Finding ways that work for us to talk about these things. So in summary, as we're getting close to wrapping up here, we learned about what healthy sexual development in children looks like, what those different levels look like from birth all the way up to 18. We talked about concerning behaviors, why some children may exhibit those, and we talked about ways to respond appropriately when these things happen, how to answer their questions. We've gotten a lot of tools. I hope you feel that you've gotten a lot of tools as you leave here today.